Introduction. Welcome. So you want to speak Japanese? Well, I've got some good news and some bad news. The good news is that Japanese is an incredibly interesting language with very few basic sounds and straightforward grammar. The bad news? If your first language is English, you routinely make thousands of language sounds that don't even exist in Japanese, and Japanese and English grammar are about as different as sushi and sandwiches. But what's life without a little challenge, right? But there's a good side even to the bad news. On the pronunciation front, Japanese sounds are few and pure. When I say pure, I mean that there aren't so-called gliding vowels like there are in English. A gliding vowel is when you start out making one vowel sound and then ever so slightly glide into a different one. For example, listen to yourself carefully as you say the word no. Well, notice that you don't make just an O sound, but you add a little oo sound onto the end. You can verify this by noticing that your lips and tongue actually move, which would be unnecessary for just one simple vowel sound. If you don't believe me, look in the mirror and say it slowly, because you definitely do it. These gliding vowels are just one aspect of English that give it a large total number of language sounds. When I talk about language sounds, I'm talking about the one-syllable building blocks that you can use to make any word in a given language. Care to hazard a guess at how many basic sound ingredients are in English? It varies by dialect, but one estimate puts the number at over 8,000. Over 9,000. Japanese, on the other hand, has very strict rules about what is and isn't a language sound. The total number of one-syllable building blocks out of which any Japanese word can be constructed is, wait for it, about 110. That's right. While we can only guess at the total inventory of English language sounds, in Japanese it's so low that we can simply count them up. This is a good thing for us English-speaking oral acrobats. It's good because phonetically, simple languages feel easy to learn, but it's challenging at the same time because it means that out of sheer habit, we're probably going to be making all kinds of strange sounds unintentionally when we speak Japanese, and it can be hard to weed those out. Have you ever heard of a foreigner speaking English and making sounds that are at best creative approximations of the true English sounds? In the beginning, we'll be doing a lot of that in Japanese. But think of it this way, you're in a much better spot than the poor Japanese guy learning English, trying to wrap his mouth around 700 and 8,000 new language sounds. When it comes to grammar, what may seem challenging is really a blessing in disguise. See, when people learn languages that are similar in structure and word order to their own, they often approach the language as if it were code, where you simply take an English sentence and then swap out each word in order to create the translation, when that's really not the case. People who do this never really get a deep understanding of their target language, so they'll only be able to speak in bits and pieces at best, not to mention causing a great deal of head-scratching for the poor souls who try to understand them. With Japanese, the grammar is so unlike English that you won't be tempted to fall into this trap. I once had a friend who would take an English sentence and then look up each word in an English-Japanese dictionary and write down the very first entry for each one to build Japanese sentences, and the results were the most hilariously unintelligible things you could ever imagine. So the long and short of this is that you'll have no choice but to really understand the nuts and bolts of the language, and that means you'll be able to speak it well. If you're a grammar phobe, don't worry, I'm right there with you. In fact, until I began to study Japanese, I saw no use for grammar whatsoever. I couldn't tell you what a subject or an object was, let alone the harder items like articles or particles. So don't fret. I'm not going to turn into your 8th grade English teacher and have you graph sentences. Actually, the name of this program, Human Japanese, is meant to describe my approach to this whole concept of learning a language. In my experience, there seems to be two main approaches to language. The first is the memorization gap. These people pick up a phrase book and just memorize all the key sentences. You probably know someone from the office who can ask for a beer in 50 different languages. That's great and all, but what happens when you want to ask what kind of beers are available, or where the beer was made, or how you can send a beer to that attractive person across the room? With the phrase approach, if you don't know the phrase, you're out of luck. The other camp is the grammar-centric camp. These people say, look, if you don't know the grammar, you're stuck with whatever tiny number of sentences you can memorize. If you understand how to string those words together, you can make any sentence you want, and they're absolutely right. The trouble is that a lot of the books that take this approach get so bogged down in the endless detail that the poor students coming in as a healthy, fun-loving individual gets turned off by the clinical sterility and just gives up, as they're probably beginning to guess. I lean more towards the second camp than the first. I'm not going to lie to you. Grammar is extremely important, but gosh darn it, language is such a huge, fun, and scary and cool thing that if people are going to learn one, then they need to have fun doing it. They need lessons from someone who speaks their language, someone who teaches it in real, warm, human terms. And if you can believe that, I'm your guy. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to learn all the really important grammar stuff, but each time I use a new term or introduce a new concept, I'll make sure you understand exactly what it is and why it's important. I'll show you how it relates to similar concepts in English, and I'll make the explanations funny and interesting to read. By the time we're done with this, you'll not only understand Japanese, but I'd wager that you'll understand English a good deal better as well. Along the way, we'll be meeting hundreds of new vocabulary words. Whenever you see any word written in Japanese characters in the main text, touch it to hear a recording. I'll go ahead and include the audio for that recording here.
ここをクリックしてください。
Rule number 2 is that for every new thing I tell you about Japanese, I'll back it up with tons and tons of example sentences so that you can see and hear what you're learning immediately. Having these example sentences right at your fingertips, interwoven with the explanations, is a key part of what makes this software so powerful. Let me show you how they work. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read the Japanese already. We'll be learning that together very soon, but just to acquaint you with what's in store, take a look at the following sentences.
日本語を勉強しましょ
The translation of that would be, let's study Japanese.
マリコさんは店の中にいます。
That translation is Mariko is inside of the store. The idea is to keep you in the flow of lessons even if you've momentarily forgotten the meaning of the word. As we all do sometimes, at the end of most chapters there are links to quizzes to help you review what you've learned. You can also access these quizzes using the review buttons at the right. The quizzes intelligently keep track of which questions you get right and wrong automatically to show you the ones you need help with more often. Answering questions correctly earns you stars and experience points, which give you an idea of how you're doing overall. The most important kind of quiz is the chapter review. Successfully passing a chapter review has the effect of unlocking the next chapter. And finally, we'll be breaking up the language lessons every now and then with cultural vignettes designed to give you a feel for the way life really works in Japan. In such chapters, I've included dozens of high-res photos to keep things interesting. Touch any photo to see it full screen, and be sure you do, since there are often bonus photos you can only see in the full screen viewer just to whet your appetite. Here are a few mouth-watering photos from the food chapter. So, picture some good-looking sushi. Getting hungry? Sushi in Japan is incredible. And that's about everything you need to know to get going. Learning Japanese is a journey like no other, and I'm thrilled to be your guide. So buckle up for the language adventure of a lifetime, and let's get started.